King Richard III is a character in English histories who is often portrayed with a sense of malice towards him, a stereotypical bad guy that is completed by his hunchback posture. This remains as not a complete lie, seeing as Richard did have a rather severe case of scoliosis. Richard was by no means a hero, but he was not the evil hunchback that is so often portrayed in Shakespeare's play and many other modern iterations of his character. Instead, Richard should be understood as a product of his time. No doubt a time of murder, deceit, and treachery in England, but still a product of the place. It is important to remember Richard as the last of the Plantagenet bloodline, a bloodline that has slowly whittled themselves down in this period that is referred to as the War of the Roses, a series of conflicts featuring cousins and uncles from different branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, all competing in a murder fest for the throne of England. If it was for the better or the worse, the other Plantagenets were constantly surrounded by family that offered counsel, heirs, generals, bishops, and sometimes even bloodshed. Richard was the exception to this, as he stood alone as the last adult male, with no useful family and surrounded by enemies eyeing up the vulnerable throne of England from all sides. King Richard III is a play that was published by the English playwright William Shakespeare in 1597. In this play, Shakespeare tells the story of a mentally tormented Richard and his rise to power, as well as his fall. Throughout the play, Shakespeare repeatedly paints the character of Richard as a devilish man with no boundaries to his ambitious nature. This is a simple and very biased look at Richard, who is much more complicated than this one-dimensional character. The problem with Shakespeare's play is not that it is biased in nature. Shakespeare is telling an entertaining story about a dead king, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem lies with the fact that Shakespeare's play remains the most popular source for both Richard's life and death. Shakespeare, who is notably not a historian, has molded our modern perception of Richard III, blurring the lines between fiction and facts. In essence, Shakespeare created a trope for a character, who might not deserve to be the origination of said trope. This trope that Shakespeare created can be easily summarized as the evil, malformed usurper. This trope appears in numerous works of fiction like Lord of the Rings' Stewards of Gondor or Star Wars' Emperor Palpatine. This trope is easily identifiable and most commonly appears in work of medieval or fantasy fiction. To break down this trope of Richard III that was created by William Shakespeare and compare it to the much older and more real Richard III is something that the real-life king deserves for the sake of his own legacy. Shakespeare does not offer a big enough picture for the complicated mess that is this time period. So my first general order of business will be to contextualize and offer some clarity in this department. The Woodville family has recently crossed paths with that of the royal Plantagenet family line that had ruled England for the past 400 years, with Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to Richard's brother, King Edward IV in 1464. Since then, her family has become a rising star in the world of English politics, holding many government seats that they use to further their own power. The influence of this family cannot and should not be understated in any way. Their influence becomes a serious threat when King Edward IV dies in 1483, leaving behind 2 adolescent sons, 1 young daughter, and a serious power vacuum. To fill this power vacuum would be the dead king's youngest brother, Richard. The eldest son of Edward IV, whose name is also Edward, was thought to be too young to rule England independently. In his regency, a competition to control the mind of this young boy starts between Richard and the Woodville family. Richard, who at this time is the Duke of Gloucester, is proclaimed as the Lord Protector of England, and is to remain in this role until the young king comes of age and is able to govern in his own right. Act 1 starts in the year 1471, shortly after King Edward IV becomes king. The first act features a conversation between Richard, who is now the Duke of Gloucester, and his older brother, George, the Duke of Clarence. The pair talk, and eventually Richard uses his deceitful manner to coax his sibling into the Tower of London. Later in that act, Richard orders for his own brother's death, sending 2 assailants to stab and drown the Duke of Clarence in a barrel of Malmsey wine. The play goes as follows.
Take that, and that, if all this will not do. I'll drown you in the Malmsey wine within.
This play starts off with a completely fabricated lie. George died on February 18th of 1478, after he revolted against his brother, King Edward IV, and tried to take his throne. After some deliberation, King Edward IV had his brother executed for treason, nearly 7 years after the events of this play take place. Richard had little, if not nothing, to do with the death of his seemingly foolish brother. Richard is so far innocent of his common stereotype. Act 1 also features the scene where Richard somehow manages to court Anne Neville, who is the widow of Edward of Lancaster, son of the previous King Henry VI. This is the same king and cousin that King Edward IV had battled, captured, and eventually killed in order to take his throne, with assistance from one of his loyal dukes. This duke was his 18-year-old brother, Richard, who was present at the Battle of Tewkesbury, in which Edward of Lancaster died. Richard and Anne then meet over the dead body of Henry VI. Shakespeare's conclusion of this conversation goes as follows.
Vouchsafe to wear this ring. To take is not to give.
After some talk, Anne Neville agrees to what was seemingly an engagement. Can you imagine marrying the guy that played a part in killing your husband? It might sound outlandish to us, but we must remember that the past is a foreign place. The most foreign of these characters might just be the royalty, who frequently seem to marry, kill, and battle relatives mostly for political and economic reasons. Did Richard really use his charm and deceiving nature to convince Anne to marry him? The answer is most likely a no. Most likely, this marriage was arranged by King Edward IV as a way to bury the hatchet between the two feuding families. Is it possible that Richard used sharp words to convince Anne to marry him? Yes, but it's even more likely that Anne and Richard were forced into the marriage with little to no say in the matter. An unfortunate fact, but one that should not add to Richard's evil stereotype. Even if Richard did want to marry Anne, this seemed as much as a forced marriage for Richard as it was for Anne. By the 12th of July, 1472, the now Duchess of Gloucester was married to the Duke of Gloucester. After the death of their father, 2 adolescent boys are sent on the road. Their destination is the Tower of London, where the 12-year-old Edward will wait to be crowned as the King of England. They are being escorted by men in their mother's family, the Woodvilles, who seem to have supreme control over the future young monarch. If they could puppet this boy, then they could indirectly rule England through him. This might just be more of a sprint and a race to London rather than a walk or march, considering the importance of their cargo. A race that they would not win. As stated by a traveling monk named Dominic Mancini, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, would catch the entourage before they reached London, taking possession of the 2 young heirs. Uncle Richard was probably met with cheers from his nephews and angry sighs from the Woodvilles, who would have rather liked to meet anyone else but the devil on this trip. Now Richard had the strings of England tied around his fist. The only thing stopping him from being king was a 12-year-old named Edward and a 9-year-old, who shared the name Richard with himself. Why use Dominic Mancini's source as a counteraction to Shakespeare's play? Dominic Mancini was an Augustan monk and poet from modern-day Italy, who wrote one of the few remaining and arguably most unbiased account of these events that have survived to this day. Mancini is commonly cited when talking about Richard III due to his unbiased outside look on the events. He has no clear motive to his writing, other than to inform. He is not politically involved in English affairs. Most importantly, though, he was a visiting monk, and only had time to gather information in that 1 year that he spent in England. Mancini tells us that when the entourage reached London, the 2 princes are placed in the protection of the Tower of London, where the preparations for Edward V's future coronation would start. As the 2 fatherless siblings entered the door of this large fortified structure, there was probably no way that these naive boys would think that this tower would soon become their prison. Did Richard know that this was the last time that his nephews would experience freedom? Was this all part of Richard's plan to become king? Or was that a latter thought? At first, everything was going accordingly to plan, until the date of Edward's coronation was pushed back 3 whole weeks. Then everything took a turn for the strange. Edward's coronation then came again 3 weeks later, and again, it went. According to Shakespeare, Richard then manages to convince the citizens of London to declare him as their king. This can be seen when Shakespeare writes,
God bless your grace. We see it and will say it. In saying so, you shall but say the truth. Then I salute you with this royal title. Long live Richard, England's worthy king.
The circumstances surrounding Richard's usurpation were much more complicated, and Shakespeare does not offer the whole truth. It probably did take a lot of convincing, or coercion, for the citizens of London to accept Richard as their new king. Instead of Edward V being proclaimed king, he was declared as an illegitimate heir to Edward IV. The truth rested in their father's previous pre-marriage contract that nullified all future marriages between Edward and any bride. If this was true, then this would make these 2 boys bastards, pushing Richard to be the next legitimate heir. Why didn't anyone say anything about this before? Well, many believe that this pre-marriage contract did not exist for Edward's previous marriage, and Richard simply made it up to take the throne. This does not change the trope much. No matter what way you look at it, he took the throne from his preteen nephew. If the pre-marriage contract was real, then it was true that Richard was rightfully king. Too bad, no copies of this pre-marriage contract exist today to prove Richard's innocence. One question then remains about this usurpation of the throne, and that is, was there a good motive behind Richard's actions? The best motive that Richard would have had was fear. He took the throne to protect himself from the Woodville family. If he left his nephew Edward to take the throne, it might put Richard's own life at risk. With the Woodvilles whispering in the ear of the young king, the potential for Edward to turn against his uncle would grow. If the Woodvilles did influence the young Edward, it would most likely be a bad thing for Richard. Using this logic, Richard took the throne to save his own skin. Shakespeare did get this part of the stereotype right. he did seemingly steal the throne of England from the people who rightfully deserved it. Richard got what he wanted, his brother's throne, but now there was one problem left. Well, actually there was two small problems that were now locked in the Tower of London. Eventually that 12-year-old would grow up, and eventually that boy would be furious that his uncle took his throne from him. This left Richard with a few options that include attempting to keep the boys in the tower for as long as they live, banish them to a monastery, or kill them. In Shakespeare's play, he portrays the latter. His order to kill his nephews reads as follows.
Oh, bitter consequence, that Edward still should live. True noble prince, cousin, thou wast not wont to be so dull. Shall I be plain? I wish the bastard dead, and I would have it suddenly performed. What sayest thou now? Speak suddenly, be brief.
Did Richard really order for the murder of his own nephews? Certainly, at this point the motive was there. The boy's very own existence brought down Richard's legitimacy to the throne. There is no explicit order recorded that condemned the two princes in the tower to death, but according to a visiting monk named Dominic Mancini, they do stop appearing in the windows of the Tower of London by the summer of 1483. The Wars of the Roses had created a trend for the Plantagenet family members to continuously murder each other for the throne. Why would Richard be any different? The death of the two boys is most likely at the behest of Richard, but who's to say that the next king found the two boys in the tower and then had them put to death? Unfortunately, with current evidence, there is no way of knowing the truth of their fate. No matter the case, two young boys would be found in the Tower of London in 1647. If it was the body of the princes, then their fate follows as such. They were imprisoned, murdered by suffocation, and stuffed under a staircase in the Tower of London. Their lives being cut short for being born to the wrong people at the wrong time. Richard has to be culprit number one for the deaths of his nephews. Once again, following the logic of saving himself from rebellions inside of England. It appears that Shakespeare may be correct again, fulfilling Richard's trope as correct in this department of kinslaying. With their throne now secure, Anne and Richard settled into the status of king and queen. The rise to power would be short-lived by Anne, who in the play is highly suggested as succumbing to an illness caused by Richard poisoning her. Interestingly enough, the day that she departed coincided with that of an eclipse, on March 16th of 1485. The play never actually tells us how Queen Consort Anne dies, but the play does heavily imply that Richard has her murdered in some way by the use of his language, such as,
Come hither, Catesby. Rumour it abroad that Anne, my wife, is very grievously sick. I will take order for her keeping close.
This is Richard commenting on a real illness that is affecting his wife, or he's simply offering an early excuse so that he can order for his wife to be murdered later. Did Richard have a motive to kill off Anne in this way? Well, there are a few ways to look at the events that took place leading up to the death of Anne. One motive that Richard might have been experiencing is the lack of allies. This was due to Richard being one of the final members of the Plantagenet dynasty. At this point, it is believed to have just been him and Elizabeth of York, who is the daughter of Edward IV. Marriage and alliance are two terms that are almost synonymous in nature when referring to nobles at this time in history. Is it possible that Richard, looking for a more powerful alliance than that of the Neville family, who would have been a little assistance to him in his upcoming battle for the throne against a man named Henry Tudor, who was a far-off cousin that had a weak claim to the throne through his mother Margaret Beaufort? Looking for an alliance with another kingdom like Castile or Denmark, or another powerful kingdom, would have been very beneficial to Richard. According to Shakespeare, Anne was murdered by Richard so that he could marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, to gain an even better claim on the throne than his current one. In the play, Richard says,
I must be married to my brother's daughter, or else my kingdom stands on brittle glass.
Shakespeare does offer a good motive as to why Richard might widow her himself, but is it a smoking gun of evidence? According to the sources for her death, they state that Anne Neville died from tuberculosis, but of course, Richard would have wanted that to be what was remembered about her death. I think that the smoking gun of evidence lies with the eclipse that coincides with her death. By murdering his wife on an eclipse, Richard managed to distract his kingdom from Anne's death, by making her death seem more religious or spiritual in nature. Richard was simply attempting to let the death of his wife fall on the shoulders of an eclipse. She could have died naturally, but Richard had quite a few motives to kill his queen, leading many to believe that he did in fact murder his wife. Henry Tudor has just landed on the shores of Britain. His goal is to dethrone Richard III and return the Lancastrian side of the Plantagenet family to the throne of England. He has spent some time in France preparing for his invasion. Supporting him are a handful of dukes from Wales, as well as others who would like to see him on the throne. The only true victory lies within the death of Richard III. Henry would get his chance as Richard marched to meet him at Bosworth Field. The ensuing battle would be a bloody one that would decide the final victor of the War of the Roses. The Lancaster Red Rose would meet the White Rose of York for the final time. Shakespeare paints Richard as a coward in this battle, someone who is undeserving of a horse and a kingdom. The play goes as follows.
A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse! Withdraw, my lord. I'll help you to a horse. Slave, I've set my life upon a cast, and I will stand the hazard of the die. I think there be 6 Richmonds in the field, 5 I have slain today instead of him. A horse, a horse. My kingdom for a horse.
Shakespeare then illustrates a fight that Richard is slain in. My kingdom for a horse is probably the most remembered quote to be taken from this play. A cowardly king who now has no steed to carry him away from his now imminent doom. The real Battle of Bosworth Field was a far more desperate and braver attempt at victory than Shakespeare depicts. After he was betrayed by one of his nobles, Richard saw that he was going to lose the battle, so he gathered his remaining forces in a last-ditch effort to slay Henry Tudor. Standing in his way was a personal bodyguard to Henry, the 6'8" John Chaney, who Richard, with a great force, drove to the ground. Richard was a trained killer and general who participated in at least 4 battles, and having some of the best training that the world could offer at this point. Richard would have died fighting, not trying to pawn his kingdom for a vehicle of flight. More evidence for his bravery can be seen in Richard's skeleton, which was found in 2012. 11 injuries were imposed upon the king, 9 of those on the skull. His initial wound was most likely from a dagger that entered just above his 10th rib on the right side. Then the onslaught truly began. With this many wounds, from this many weapons, it was clear that Richard was putting up a good fight, but he was eventually surrounded. The death blow most likely came when a sword or halberd went through his skull and brain, then exited on the opposite side of his head. For what it was worth, Richard died brave, while in his life, it seemed like he lived in fear from the Woodvilles and Tudors. Soon after the conclusion of this battle, Henry Tudor would marry Richard III's niece, Elizabeth of York, joining the 2 feuding families of York and Lancaster for the final time. Then, he would be crowned as Henry VII of England. Then, from there, the rest is history. Shakespeare's play was the driving force to paint Richard with his modern stereotypes. Why would Shakespeare do this to King Richard III? The answer lies with his audience. Shakespeare was writing at the time of the rule of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was the granddaughter of the man who took Richard's throne. This legitimacy was much needed because she was not even supposed to be queen after all. It was only after the death of her half-brother and half-sister that she rose to the position. Writing an unbiased play on the life of Richard III would have most likely been the last thing that a young William Shakespeare ever did. More Tudor propaganda pieces can be seen by looking at the portraits of Richard III. In most portraits, Richard can be seen with a frown on his face, a look of hatred in his eyes, and an aggressive shoulder unevenness, suggesting that he was a hunchback. These portraits were older ones that Henry VII painted over to make Richard appear more evil. The real Richard can be seen when pictures are analyzed using infrared scanning. Under these pictures shows that while his shoulder did slope minorly from scoliosis, it was heavily exaggerated. It was also clear that he did not have a permanent frown and hatred in his eyes, as they too were painted over. If the Tudors could change his face, imagine how much his reputation could be changed by them. It is safe to say that William Shakespeare, in combination with the Tudor dynasty, ruined any chance of Richard to be remembered as anything else rather than a malformed, evil usurper who murdered his adolescent nephews, killed his wife, and gave birth to a trope that remains to this day. A huge shout out to Schrodinger's Moose for helping me make this video. He narrated the parts of the play, and he runs his own history YouTube channel. I highly recommend his series on Jacob Kettler. It's very interesting. Go subscribe to him if you have a chance. I'll have his information linked down below. Thank you.